Well, thank you to those here at St. Anthony's and those at the Michael Ramsey Center, and to meet folks in person for the first time is nice. It's also great to have a former student and a parishioner here who's studying here at Durham, Brendan there. And I just wanted to also say my wife and my youngest son, who just finished his first year at university, are traveling with me, so they're here as well. And they look as well as I do after that long trip, so maybe it's in the genes. All right, some of this you might know already, a little bit about Pusey, but I'm probably going to share more than many of you would need to know. I should also mention that doctorate in Toronto was in medieval theology, and the Monkhood of All Believers was the Rome thesis, so I'm actually out of kind of my geographical time period here, but as an Anglican who does work on monasticism, you have to do work on Anglican monasticism. So Edward Bouvier Pusey was born on August 22nd, 1800, to Philip and Lucy. He was educated at a small preparatory school in Mitcham by the Anglican clergyman Richard Roberts. And Roberts grounded Pusey in the classics. Turns out Roberts was also a strict disciplinarian, and his success in placing students at Eton was well known. Later in life, Pusey reminisced about his time under Roberts, and he said this, and this is a great quote because it's got some language that might be familiar to those of you here from England. I had to look some things up, but I do know what they mean now. But he reminisced about Roberts, and he said this, he was a wonderful teacher. He would never allow cribs, which is actually copying someone else's work, I guess. We call that plagiarism. So he made us tear out the Latin translations of Homer and Greek writers where we could without destroying the text. He would make us translate a great deal at first sight. Every Sunday we had to write an English theme, and during each week a Latin theme, and a copy of longs and shorts and of lyrics. Pusey continues, towards the end of my life, towards the end of my time there, he made me do 4 copies of Greek verses also every week. In later years, when I was in the Hebdomadal Council at the University of Oxford, and they were talking about the requirements for liturgo and moderations, I used to say that I knew a school in which half the boys could have passed moderations before they were 11 years of age. Perhaps that was saying a great deal, Pusey concludes, but they were very well prepared, talking about others as if he's not included there. Liddon, in his biography and study of Pusey, says this, certainly Mr. Roberts must have largely contributed to make Pusey the scholar he became. The sensitive impatience of bad scholarship, which was one of Pusey's characteristics, would not have been so marked without the training and bracing of Mitcham. In later life, accuracy had become to him almost a new sense or instinct. The raw material, Liddon continues, of such a faculty doubtless is God's gift as being part of the original outfit of the human mind. But for its development, it is largely dependent upon early guidance and exercise. So Liddon, of course, as we all know, is it's a bit of hagiographical elements to Liddon at times, and perhaps no one deserves it more than Pusey. But again, he's kind of saying that Pusey's native intellect was just made alive by his time under Roberts there at Mitcham. Yet at the same time, Liddon tells us that it would not appear that Mitcham, however, did anything for Pusey's religious life or convictions. As in most schools of the period, religion was treated as a necessary propriety rather than a living influence. The boys went to church on Sundays, and prayers were read every morning and evening. But there was no energetic recognition of religion as prescribing motives and governing conduct. The catechism was learnt, Liddon says, but it was not explained. When Pusey was 11 and a half years old, he was sent with his older brother to Eton, arriving there in January of 1812. They lived in the house of the Reverend Thomas Carter. Pusey, it appears, did not make many friends at Eton and was known more for his chess playing than for his sports, which is probably true of most academics. Later, I don't know about chess playing, but certainly better than sports. Later in life, he wrote that his years at Eton were not the happiest in my life, but he could also, on occasion, speak very positively of those years. Liddon says that, quote, such apparent contradictions in Pusey's thinking are easily reconciled. The one phrase, may refer to a single episode, that he wasn't happy there for something he's particularly thinking about. But Liddon thinks the other elements of his positive speaking about his time at Eton to the general tenor of his life, and Liddon thinks that Pusey was generally happy there. Like his time at the prep school, Eton did little, though, to foster Pusey's priestly vocation. There were prayers in the chapel, some religious lessons, and many of the masters were priests. But Pusey never claimed that Eton fostered his religious vocation. About a year before he left Eton, however, he was confirmed in the Royal Chapel of St. James in London by the Right Reverend William Howley, Bishop of London and former Professor of Divinity at Oxford and the future Archbishop of Canterbury. In October of 1817, when Pusey was only 17 years old himself, his dad sent him to study with the Reverend Edward Maltby, Vicar of Buckton, Prebendary of Lincoln Cathedral, and, perhaps appropriate for this location, the future Bishop of Durham. Pusey remained with Maltby for 15 months, going up to Christ Church, Oxford in January of 1819. At Christ Church, Pusey was tutored by Thomas Short, future Bishop of Sodor-Aman and then Bishop of St. Asaph. Pusey graduated first in his class in 1822, with John Keble serving as one of his viva voce examiners. As we probably all know, in 1823, Pusey was awarded an Oriel Fellowship, which would, of course, radically alter the course of his life. Aspiring to be ordained, Pusey attended lectures by Dr. Charles Lloyd, Regius Professor of Divinity and later Bishop of Oxford. It was Lloyd that encouraged Pusey to go to Germany to study theology and biblical studies, both of which were growing increasingly liberal. Thus, Pusey spent the long vacation of 1825 and the year 1826 to 1827 at the universities of Berlin, Bonn, and Göttingen, famously studying for a time in Berlin under Friedrich Schleiermacher. And I won't go into it in this paper, but I'm actually suspecting that Pusey's time in Germany is much more influential on his thinking regarding monasticism than probably anyone has recognized before. And maybe that'll make a little more sense by the end of the paper, but I just simply say that out loud because if you're looking for something to work on in research, maybe that's an avenue. I don't have time to do that, but maybe someone in this room could. That'd be great. All right. So again, this brings us up to, again, his appointment at Oxford in 1823. His time in Germany up to 1827. So, according to his correspondence, Pusey had hoped to be ordained a deacon in December of 1825. So that would have been after returning from Germany the first time. But the event was delayed, it turns out, nearly 3 years, until June of 1828. So actually just a couple of weeks would be the anniversary of his ordination of the diaconate, June 1st. A mere 11 days later, on June 12th, he married Maria Barker, whom he had met 10 years earlier. They had one son and 3 daughters, only one of whom actually survived Pusey, before his wife died of consumption at only 38 years old in 1839. So they were not married quite 11 years. In November 1828, just 5 months after getting married, so jumping back now to 1828, he was appointed Regius Professor of Hebrew at Oxford, which included a canonry at Christ Church, necessitating his ordination to the priesthood on November 23rd, 1828. Now, Pusey, taking up this position at Oxford and having the canonry at Christ Church, thought of his teaching appointment primarily as a theological one, not just merely philological. As well, he saw part of his responsibility as a cathedral canon to train clergy better than they were currently being trained at Oxford or Cambridge, the only places where one could receive ordination training at the time. This appointment at Christ Church, and his desire to form future clergy, led Pusey in 1832 to write a small pamphlet entitled Remarks on the Perspective and Past Benefits of Cathedral Institutions. This pamphlet, we will see, lays out a principle in Pusey's thinking that frames his advocacy for the re-establishment of monasticism in the Church of England. But before we get there, we need to understand this pamphlet. The genesis of Pusey's pamphlet on cathedrals lies in the promulgation of the Sacramental Test Act of 1828, the Roman Catholic Relief Act of 1829, and the Reform Act of 1832, which some scholars have argued, quote, those acts together, quote, amounted to a constitutional revolution in which Anglican political hegemony was decisively displaced and the dominance of the Church of England was undermined. In other words, the government, it was thought, was dismantling elements of the national church, or worse, suggesting that the established church had no future in the life of the nation. Further, the early 1830s witnessed the publication of an assortment of pamphlets, addresses, and articles offering diverse programs for the reform of the Anglican Church. Many authors, clerical and lay, rushed into print with plans for reducing pluralities and non-residents, ending gross inequalities in clerical incomes, eliminating abuses of patronage, sinecures, and waste, improving clerical discipline, building new churches and schools, and promoting the church's mission. So there's this great amount of literature that's being written and published, like 1832. I think that was a result, in particular, of the Reform Act. And so they're just offering all these ideas of how to reform the church. And again, the genesis of them was looking at the realities of the church and trying to address the real problems. But as we'll see here in a minute, Pusey thought some just went absolutely way too far. And so I just want to look at two of these publications that are illustrative of what was going on at the time. The first was titled Plan of Church Reform, written in 1832 by Robert Henley, a lawyer and a member of Parliament, who happened to also be the brother-in-law of the Prime Minister, Robert Peel. Henley promoted the idea of a redistribution of church property and revenues to make the church's task of evangelization more effective. In his plan, the cathedrals would bear the major burden for this sharing of wealth. The second pamphlet that I think is worth looking at, Principles of Church Reform, was written in 1833 by the Reverend Thomas Arnold, headmaster at Rugby School. Arnold wrote directly in response to Henley's pamphlet, which he thought was insufficient and of the wrong kind. Arnold began with the premise that, quote, church establishment was in extreme danger. That being the case, he said, calls for far-reaching remedies, such as the commutation of tithes, the remodeling of the episcopate for greater efficiency in church government, something that we probably still haven't accomplished yet today, the division of dioceses to extend the church's influence into every town, the annexation of prebends and unpaid livings, and the enforcement of clerical residence. Arnold thought that the Church of England was failing to change with the times and needed to work with the dissenting churches for greater effectiveness across the nation. Pusey's pamphlet was also in direct response to Henley's, but it was one of those arguing for a kind of reform that did not destroy the Church of England or her venerable institutions. The pamphlet was likely also motivated by Pusey's time in Germany, where he saw that the critical scholarship coming out of German universities was wrecking the church. So a logical solution in England, he wrote, to avoid the same fate was to move theological training out of the universities and into cathedral seminaries. Pusey actually wrote his pamphlet in response to Henley in late 1832, sending it first to the well-known, of course, John Henry Newman, just before he left on a trip to continental Europe. In reaction to Newman's comments, Pusey decided not to publish it as a response to Henley, though that's what it was written as, but instead as a standalone argument for cathedral renewal, publishing it in 1833. Now, if you spent any time in this literature of this time period, this pamphlet is like 130 pages long. You know, it's the typical, like I got a letter this morning, I didn't like what it said, so I wrote a pamphlet in response. Not a book, just a pamphlet of 130 pages this afternoon, out in the post in the evening. So anyway, it's a very long pamphlet with many points, but mostly what concerns me today is actually within the first 15 pages or so. Pusey writes this in his pamphlet, quote, in every portion of the Christian name, ever since learning became essential to the church, there have been institutions corresponding more or less to the cathedral foundations of this country. Everywhere there have been institutions to further the education and instruction of the clergy and to provide for the maintenance of theological learning. End quote. These institutions have been hugely beneficial, Pusey thinks, so much so that, quote, in speaking of the prospective necessity of cathedral or some similar institutions, I was unavoidably to remark on some portion of the benefits which these have already rendered, and no more convenient mode suggested itself by which these might compendiously be exhibited than to examine how much of the theology which we to this day enjoy was produced by or in connection with cathedral institutions. He continues, quote, I own, myself astonished upon examination to observe how name after name of those whose memory we cherish connected itself with these institutions, until at last scarcely any were left among our earlier divines, which were not fostered either by our cathedral or, in some few exceptions, by our collegiate institutions. Cathedrals are so important, writes Pusey, that, quote, almost all the theology transmitted to us is derived from them, that under God we owe our liturgy to them, our beautiful and holy translation of the scriptures to them, and to our collegiate foundations. So the first thing that you can see Pusey's doing there is he just stacks up this list of the who's who of Anglican divines since the Reformation, 16th century, and then tells you all the cathedrals they were associated with. And, ipso facto, good theology comes out of cathedrals, as we all know. And still to this day, we all know that's where all good theology is done. So, but that's the argument he's trying to show, that without these cathedrals, we never would have had these divines in the Church of England. So that's just the first kind of move he makes in the very long pamphlet. Pusey then lays out reasons for the existence of cathedrals, with this primary one being the education of the clergy, which is why he had just done his little historical exercise, because he wants to, again, educate clergy from the cathedrals, because he assumes if it stays in the university, then you're just going to get the German church of the 19th century. So, we're not here today to decide whether that's true or not, but anyway, he wants the education of clergy is his primary reason for the existence of cathedrals. But he also advocates for cathedrals because they provide proper rest for parochial clergy. You're tired of being out in your parish church, come to the cathedral for a time of rest. They provide proper recreation for parochial clergy, right? Come into town and hear the choir sing and be restored and renewed. And they aid, and this is a good kind of Pusey language, in inflaming devotion among the clergy. I'd love to experience that cathedral that Pusey's talking about there. But yeah, just come into town, go to the cathedral, and there you go. He writes this. This is a long quotation, but I think worth reading in full. Did then cathedral institutions render no other service, that is, of education, proper rest, recreation, inflaming devotion, the present arrangement by which the annexation of cathedral preferment to parochial duties provides for the minister a period of comparative rest during his residence at the cathedral, and on his return to the scene of his labors, confers upon him an increased weight, would be preferable to one whose only object would be to provide an adequate income. Since, moreover, it is desirable that the recreations of the clergy should partake of the character of their profession, it were a peculiarly happy circumstance that the refreshment, which all would allow to be necessary, should in those cases be directly connected with their habits and duties. That an exchange of employment had been made equally serviceable with entire rest. He continues, few probably there have been upon whom at some period and under some circumstances the pure and holy harmony of the choral service has not produced an impression for which they have felt grateful. It is then not difficult to imagine what must be its refreshing, healing, strengthening, purifying influence to those who return to it after periods of labor and exhaustion, or how salutary it has been in awakening the first feelings of devotion in many who had been but too seldom attracted to religious services of any kind, or how edifying it may be to many to whom it has always been the natural expression of devotion. So again, I just saw a book in a secondhand store today about Victorians and Romanticism. And so perhaps this is Pusey being a little overly romantic about what happens when you go up to the cathedral from your parish church in the countryside. But I do think there's something to it. I don't think Pusey's being false in his sense that these are what are needed in the cathedrals. But again, they can help the minister both be refreshed, but also basically just be a better minister when he goes back to his living. But for Pusey, and this is the principle that I want to get at, when anything has often been abused, and he acknowledges that cathedrals have been abused, it is inferred that it must always be so. He writes, its very name condemns it, even where the abuse is precluded. Pusey was certainly open to the closure of any institution that was not of benefit to the church. He writes this, quote, should any offices be found upon examination to be incapable of being connected with efficient duties or of being rendered of real service, they might at all times better be dispensed with, the application of their funds to the furtherance of practical religion. So again, Pusey's not saying you shouldn't close institutions, but you can't, you have to figure it out if they should be closed first. Before even talking about the expense of running the institution, Pusey wrote that there needed to be discernment about whether there are services which might, by their means, if only rightly employed, be accomplished more efficiently than by any other, whether there be any duties left for them to discharge. The goal for Pusey was not for outlived institutions to be destroyed, but, in his language, to be converted to any practical end. They were to be reanimated instead of destroyed. The goal, he says, is reanimating instead of destroying. He concludes, quote, "As then in the former case, that is, of institutions that have outlived their purposes, it is better altogether to remove what is incapable of amelioration. So, in the latter, it will be advisable to retain whatever in its present form is capable of use." And all of this is good for the church, he believes, because, quote, "the less violence is done to the habits of men, the less sudden the transition, the more stable probably will be the new institutions, and the more real and effective the change produced." With this, Pusey has laid out an important principle in his thinking regarding historical institutions that need renewal. We can call Pusey's thinking the reanimation principle, if you will. Recall that Pusey himself had been educated in some of the most prestigious educational institutions in England, but they made little impact on his faith, for they too were in need of reanimation. Just like cathedrals, there were lots of ecclesial areas in need of reanimation in the early 19th century, theological education and cathedral institutions being only two of them. Throughout Pusey's career at Oxford University, he would identify a number of additional areas in need of reanimation, perhaps most famously the sacrament of confession, and of course the monastic life, to which we shall return in due time. So again, the main thing I want us to see from that cathedral, that pamphlet on cathedrals, is just that you don't get rid of something without examining its usefulness first. And usefulness we could dive into if he was thinking Augustinian in that sense. But anyway, the point being is that if you can reanimate it, you should reanimate it, because if it's meeting a need, it's easier to reanimate the thing that's meeting the need, even if it takes on new responsibilities and new needs. So let's talk about a little bit more about this reanimation principle. The way to reanimate, writes Pusey, he says, quote, "ought not to be to ascertain how much one might by any possibility curtail, but how much one ought to retain. The process," he says, "is to determine what offices the good estate of the church demands, if not in their present, at least in some kindred form, what duties are required for the healthful condition of the church." So in that one section, that one sentence basically, he lays out 3 steps to reanimation. And we'll go through these 3 steps. First, retention is the goal, not curtailment. Such a sentiment, it would seem, is connected to Pusey's commitment to the Catholicity of the church, here understood literally as a continuity of institutions, not just a theological or creedal construct. For Anglicanism historically, Catholicity was not rooted exclusively in a succession of bishops, but in a continuity of true doctrine. For Pusey, the Holy Scriptures were the source of the church's Catholicity, for everything flowed from them, but only as interpreted by the Church Catholic. He writes this in his introduction to his translation of Augustine's Confessions. Quote, "There is no semblance of contrasting Scripture and the Fathers as coordinate authority." So I think that's his jab there at the Roman Church. "Scripture is reverenced as paramount," he continues. "The doctrine of the Old or New Testament is the source. The Catholic Fathers and ancient bishops have but the office of collecting out of that same doctrine. The Old and New Testaments are the fountain, the Catholic Fathers the channel through which it has flowed down to us." The contrast then, in point of authority, is not between Holy Scriptures and the Fathers, but between the Fathers and us. Not between the book interpreted and the interpreters, but between one class of interpreters and another. Between ancient Catholic truth and modern private opinions. That's the end of his quotation. Again, there's a lot going on in that quotation, but the Catholicity begins in the scriptures through the channel of the church fathers and ancient bishops, and then down to us. And so the rub is with the us and how the scriptures have been interpreted. In his 1851 university sermon, The Rule of Faith, as maintained by the Fathers in the Church of England, Pusey argued that Anglicans held to the same doctrines promulgated by the early church fathers, and that these doctrines flowed from the scriptures. And not only did the Church of England maintain the true doctrine of the early church, Pusey thought, but she maintained, more or less, the early church's offices and institutions too. And I say more or less because they didn't have monasticism, so that's at least the less of the more or less. Thus, for Pusey, all ancient ecclesiastical institutions are the product of the church's interpretation of Scripture, and they should be duly protected, for they are a sign of the church's Catholicity. So the first principle, again, there is retention, not curtailment. The second step the second step of this reanimation principle is that those who oversee the church, especially her bishops, need to determine what offices the good estate of the church demands. If the church decides, for whatever reason, that it needs cathedrals, then they must be retained, even if they need to be reanimated. That's Pusey's illustration. That's what he's using. That's what he's arguing. But this language of good estate, what offices the good estate of the church demands, the language of good estate in Pusey's pamphlet, I think, likely comes from the collect titled A Prayer for All Conditions of Men from the 1662 Book of Common Prayer's Morning Office. The collect at least reads in part this way. You probably know it. O God, the creator and preserver of all mankind, we humbly beseech thee for all sorts and conditions of men, that thou wouldest be pleased to make thy ways known unto them, thy saving health unto all nations. More especially we pray for the good estate of the Catholic Church, that it may be so guided and governed by thy good spirit. So not the end of the collect, but the end of the part I want to quote. In the context of his pamphlet, the offices needed for the good estate of the church are clearly a learned and holy clergy. As summarized above, Pusey thinks that cathedrals can provide for the proper theological training of those in holy orders or preparing for holy orders, but they can also provide rest for a weary priest, recreation for that very same weary priest, and assistance in devotional practices. The general principle here is that any institution that proves itself to the good estate of the Church Catholic should be retained, and, of course, if necessary, reanimated. Right? So, Pusey's, again, you want to find out if something can be retained, not curtailed. And second, if it's contributing to the good estate of the Church Catholic, then you definitely should retain it, even if it needs to be reanimated. The last step of the reanimation principle, Pusey says, those same overseers, the bishops, need to establish what duties the church requires for her spiritual health. And once those are determined, institutions that can meet those duties need to be created or reanimated. So Pusey's language here is the healthful condition of the church. I think this is also likely inspired by a prayer from morning prayer, which is called A Prayer for the Clergy and the People. It goes like this. Almighty and everlasting God, who alone workest great marvels, send down upon our bishops and pastors and all congregations committed to their charge the healthful spirit of thy grace, and that they may truly please thee, pour upon them the continual dew of thy blessing. Grant us, O Lord, for the honor of our advocate and mediator, Jesus Christ. Amen. The language of healthful, in both the collect and in Pusey's pamphlet, refers to something that is conducive to moral or spiritual welfare or prosperity, or something that is marked by intellectual or moral soundness. For Pusey, any institution that builds up the church's morality and its spiritual soundness should be retained and even reanimated. So again, I'm not sure if those collects were the inspiration for Pusey's language, though I suspect they were. But again, if we can reanimate, if we can retain, let's do it. If it's for the good estate of the church, let's keep it, even if it needs to be reanimated. And if it's certainly contributing to the healthful existence of the church, then keep it, even if it needs to be reanimated. So again, to summarize, Pusey's reanimation principle consists of those three steps. Retain, not curtail, reanimate offices leading to good estate, and thirdly, reanimate those institutions that contribute to the health of the church. The reanimation principle, I suggest then, is a great starting point for understanding and contextualizing Pusey's thinking regarding monasticism. Okay, so you probably came to hear about Pusey monasticism. Page 11, here we are. As is well known, the institution of monasticism in England was rejected throughout the middle decades of the 16th century, despite its health and vitality in late medieval England. And I'm so happy I'm giving this paper in Durham. It was the monastery that held out, I think, the longest, maybe it's one of the last, if not the last closed. So it's great that we are here in the shadow of the cathedral. Again, so no matter its health or vitality, middle decades of the 16th century, they were being shut down. As you know, from 1536 to 1540, the monasteries in England and Ireland were dissolved under the oversight of Henry VIII, and of course his loyal chief minister, Thomas Cromwell. And despite a number of calls for monasticism's reinstitution in subsequent centuries, it was only on Trinity Sunday, 1841, that monastic life formally returned to the Church of England when Marian Hughes vowed poverty, chastity, and obedience to God before Edward Pusey in the home of Father Charles Seeger. So, from the start of the Oxford movement, which is more or less 1833, there was talk, especially in the letters to and from Pusey and Newman, of bringing monasticism back into the English church. Pusey's rationale for monasticism is consistent with his rationale for cathedral institutions. I certainly didn't find them all, but in my Reforming the Monastery, I do kind of cover those intervening centuries about who was making calls for the re-establishment of monasticism. And I know there's more, but there's a good number there if you were curious as to what's happening in those middle centuries there between 1540 and 1840. According to Liddon, Pusey saw at least three reasons for the reanimation of monastic life. First, it led believers, by divine grace, to give themselves up to a life of sacrifice. And I'm using Liddon's language here. So, led believers, by divine grace, to give up themselves to a life of sacrifice. Second, those in religious life could be used to recover masses of the population, which had outgrown all the existing machinery of the church. And lastly, monasticism solves, quote, the difficulty of finding suitable employment for many unmarried women. I think, did Father James talk, or did Sarah and Hay talk, Dr. James talk about this when he did his talk? If you came to Sarah and Hay James's talk, he gave a talk for me last year at Nashotah House where he makes it very enjoyable to listen to about these unmarried women. Let's just put it that way. So he's great about that. Okay, so as a subset of these things, Pusey gave three other reasons in a letter from 1839 to Walter Hooke. The letters to Walter Hooke, the vicar of Leeds. And of course, this is a well-known letter that's in Liddon's life. And that's where Pusey calls them Sisters of Charity. He says this: 1, they would belong to and foster a, quote, high tone in the church. Second, monasticism would give, quote, a holy employment to many who yearn for something. And thirdly, Pusey says, it would direct zeal, which will otherwise often go off in some irregular way, or go over to Rome. That's a concern in the letters between Pusey and Newman, as we'll see. There's also Pusey's notion that monasticism was part of the primitive church, and therefore worthy of reanimation. He writes, he writes in a letter to the Archbishop of Canterbury, the church has, quote, in her monastic institutions, a refuge from the weariness and vanities of the world, and a means of higher perfection to individuals. Which many sigh after, and which might be revived in a primitive form, but which as yet we have not. And then, again, he says something very similar to that Liddon records as to monasticism. I do not go further than Archbishop Leighton in what he says about retreats for men of, and then there's just a blank, no one knows what the next line was, and mortified tempers, which he, Archbishop Leighton, regrets, which were lost at the Reformation. I, Pusey, have long strongly thought that we needed something of this sort. It is not Romanist, but primitive. So, Pusey's first reason for the monastic life is that some men and women will be led by God to give themselves up to a life of sacrifice, to such a degree that they will desire a formal monastic life, or else they will convert to Roman Catholicism. Newman thought similarly. Newman, writing to Thomas Mosley, his former pupil and then brother-in-law in 1839, so before his conversion, about 6 years before his conversion, says, quote, "I should not be surprised to see conversions to Romanism somewhere or other. I think the women will be going, unless nunneries are soon held out to them in our church." On the same theme, Newman wrote to the barrister J.R. Hope in January of 1842, quote, "I am almost in despair of keeping men together. The only possible way is a monastery. Men want an outlet for their devotional and penitential feelings, and if we do not grant it, to a dead certainty, they will go where they can find it. This is the beginning and the end of the matter." In short, there are those in the church who yearn for something greater. This argument meets Pusey's second reanimation principle: reanimate offices leading to good estate. That men and women can live out their God-given vocation fosters a higher tone in the church and leads to orderliness within the church, thereby aiding the church in her divine mission of loving God and neighbor and making disciples of all nations. Right? So again, that this good estate that people can live out their greater devotional tendencies needs to be retained. Pusey and Newman and others are arguing for this. People will leave if we don't offer them something like the monastic life. And again, I think that is Pusey's an office that leads to good estate in the church. This is the argument I've made in the Monkhood of All Believers for traditional monasticism. If God's going to continue to call men and women into traditional monastic life, then they need to have monasteries where they can go live out their God-given vocations. So similar sentiment to Pusey and Newman. So the second reason for reanimating the religious life is so that monastics could, Pusey writes, that monastics could be used, again in his language, to recover masses of population which had outgrown all the existing machinery of the church. As you well know, the mid-18th century Church of England struggled to keep up with rapid industrialization and the subsequent growth of towns and cities. So much so that at times there was only one parish for tens of thousands of members of the Church of England. Now, who would have gone to that parish is a different story, but one parish for thousands of people. Part of a solution to this problem was put forward by the aforementioned pamphlets that attacked cathedral institutions. Those authors believed that the cathedrals were overly wealthy and thereby should be plundered to fund the creation of more parishes and to train clergy for those new parishes. At the same time, the English church struggled to minister adequately to the social ills plaguing society, oftentimes also the fruit of rapid industrialization. Part of the solution to this problem, it was thought, was to create monastic communities, sisterhoods of charity, to use Pusey's language, who could minister to the poor and the destitute in ways that no one else could. Again, we see Pusey in agreement with the Anglican Newman, mostly because the two of them are playing off of each other all the time. I mean, it might have been the echo chamber at this point between Pusey and Newman about monastic life, but it's still good to see these things corroborated by someone else. Writing in 1836 in Home Thoughts Abroad, number 2, which was originally published serially in the British Magazine, Newman writes this, again, long quote, but worth reading, quote, "I scarcely expect that anything will be devised of a nature to meet the peculiar evils existing in a densely peopled city. Benevolent persons hope, by increasing our instruments of usefulness, to relieve them. Doubtless they may so relieve them, and no charitable effort can fail of a blessing. New churches and lay cooperation will do something. But I confess, I think, that some instrument different in kind is required for the present emergency. Great towns will never be evangelized merely by the parochial system. They are beyond the sphere of the parish priest, burdened as he is with the endearments and anxieties of a family and the secular restraints and engagements of the establishment. The unstable multitude cannot be influenced and ruled except by uncommon means, by the evident sight of disinterested and self-denying love and elevated firmness. The show of domestic comfort, the decencies of furniture and apparel, the bright hearth, the comfortable table, good and innocent as they are in their place, are as ill-suited to the missionary of a town population as to an apostle. Heathens and quasi-heathens, such as the miserable rabble of a large town, were not converted in the beginning of the gospel, nor now, as it would appear, by the sight of domestic virtues or domestic comforts in their missionary. Surely Providence has his various means adapted to different ends. I think that religious institutions, over and above their intrinsic recommendations, are the legitimate instruments of working upon a populace. One can only imagine Newman writing those words while itching from the hair shirt he was wearing or starving from having not gone and eaten in a while. But yeah, so a parish priest can never reach the heathens and quasi-heathens in the towns because, they're at home taking care of a wife and kids and with a good domestic life. And so religious is who can reach the towns, Newman says. A lot in that quotation that's worth unpacking, but we don't have the time. So for Newman, just like for Pusey, monasticism held the key to evangelizing the growing population, who were beyond the reach of the established church, due to a paucity of parishes and for ministering to those in need of benevolence. This need was also recognized by a group of churchmen who met in London in April 1844. In a letter dated April 22, 1844, which happened to be the day that Lucy Pusey died or was buried, Pusey got a letter. But that letter, again, coming from the statesman John Manners, informed Pusey of a meeting of those in favor of beginning a women's monastic community as a monument to the memory of the poet Robert Southey. Those present, the letter says, quote, had resolved to take preliminary steps for the establishment and permanent maintenance of a sisterhood, living under religious rule and engaged in some works of mercy, such as visiting the poor or the sick in their own homes, visiting hospitals, workhouses, or prisons, feeding, clothing, and instructing destitute children, assisting in burying the dead. Right, so just notice that list right there. It's not so they can pray, sevenfold daily office. It's a sisterhood to be useful. And again, I don't know what Sarenhid's paper was about, but in the collection, the edited collection of his papers from the Brett conference last year at Nashotah House, he talks about this argument of usefulness and how persuasive it was in early monastic things to convince people to get on board with it. And oftentimes this is true of religious orders, the kind of contemplative comes later, in Anglican religious orders. There was a general concern that two of the biggest problems facing the Church of England could be solved by the reanimation of the monastic life, not to mention the perceived, or perhaps it's even a real problem of the difficulty of finding suitable employment for unmarried women. For the Church's spiritual health, monastics were needed to evangelize and minister to those in need of assistance. As the Reverend William Gressley, prebendary of Lichfield Cathedral, wrote in 1851, quote, if this land is ever again to be evangelized, if our poor are ever again to be brought within the limits of Christ's fold, I am persuaded it must be through the means of Christian brotherhoods, sisterhoods of mercy and charity, colleges of Christian men and women. Right, so again, Pusey's not alone in thinking that this is a good thing to do to reach the new reality of the 19th century. Pusey's last reason for reanimating the monastic life was because it was of primitive origin, dating back to the earliest days of the Christian Church. Most mid-19th century Anglicans viewed monasticism as a Roman Catholic institution. For example, the Christian Observer of 1844, a periodical published by evangelical Anglicans, wrote that, quote, we have taken up the lives of English, and then parentheses, Romanist, saints and hermits, lately published. So this is the collection of the English lives that Newman worked on. We've taken up these lives of the English saints and hermits lately published to exhibit the progress which the insidious heresies of what is called the Catholic system are making throughout the land. In most of those books, the peculiar tenets, rites, and observances of the Church of Rome are unequivocally set forth and boldly defended. or rather are not so much defended, as quietly spoken of as if needing no defense, any more than we should defend a man for stating that he believed in a God, or being just and charitable in his dealings. And the most offhand way in the world, celibacy, monasticism, saint worship, false miracles, anti-scriptural doctrines, and the most absurd and superstitious notions and practices are treated of very much as if no question had ever arisen respecting them. It'd be great here to also talk about Punch Magazine's caricatures of Anglicans, like what Renee Collar has done that for us. But again, you can see the visual equivalence of those words. So those involved in the Oxford movement, the nobler minds of the English church, in Liddon's words, knew that these ancient institutions were not Roman, but primitive and thereby Christian. So again, the evangelical Anglicans are just saying these are Roman Catholic doctrines, and they're sneaking them in by talking about the lives of the English saints. Again, Newman shares Pusey's convictions about the primitive nature of monasticism, not just its Roman nature. For Newman, monasticism had existed, quote, from the time of St. Philip's daughters in the Acts of the Apostles, the private and domestic observance of an ascetic life for religion's sake and to the honor of Christ. And just as a quick aside, as I start landing this plane, I had never recalled reading that quotation from Newman, though I know I have, but it's an odd scriptural place to put the founding of monastic life. I mean, you can't beat the Carmelites for getting Elijah, but at the same time, it's an odd place to pick the Acts of the Apostles, 21 verse 9 as the place. There's at least an example of monastic life in the scriptures. So, Newman wrote to his friend Richard Froude, before Froude's untimely death in 1836, that he would renounce his positive opinion of monasticism if someone could show him that, quote, the primitive church condemned it. Pusey even went so far himself to suggest that it was a secular prince, not the Reformation. So it was a secular prince, not the Reformation, that destroyed the monastic life. For Pusey, monasticism, and that's a good argument for he did it, not the church, right? So the church is always the church capital. Pusey thought that many, if not most, of the church's most holy members historically were fruits of the monastic life. There's a Catholicity to monasticism that was not tangential to or adjunctive of the very being of the church. For Pusey, monasticism was not an elective add-on, but an essential component of the Catholic Church. And this is why it should be retained and reanimated, not curtailed, just like cathedral institutions. In the end, Pusey came to see that the peculiar character of Anglicanism was not just its Protestant nature, but its primitive character. And that meant monasticism had a place in the fabric of the church. Thus, monasticism needed to be reestablished, and in doing so, reanimated. The necessity of monasticism for Pusey is rooted in his threefold reanimating principle. And a reanimated monasticism retains a primitive Christian institution, revives offices leading to the good estate of the church, and restores those institutions that contribute to the health of the church. Thank you.